Hello, I'm Nicholas Tiedemann, and I'm here to introduce Marty Rowland. Marty Rowland is an environmental engineer and a member of the board of directors of the Henry George School of Social Science in New York City. He's going to talk to us today about Elinor Ostrom's ideas about governing the commons. There is widespread ignorance of, and when there is not ignorance, widespread confusion about the commons and so-called tragedies of the commons. Marty's original research on the managed water commons in Tampa, Florida, in a comparative analysis with water management in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, confirmed the theory and research of Nobel economist Elinor Ostrom, who wrote the groundbreaking book Governing the Commons in 1990. Although Ostrom does not mention Henry George, Kate Raworth, author of the equally groundbreaking work Donut Economics, published in 2017, mentions both George and Ostrom in her theory of evolutionary economics. Marty incorporates Ostrom's and Raworth's ideas into a Georgist framework that offers a roadmap out of the neoclassical economics tragedy of a failed technique mistaken for science. Marty.
Great. I hope that I'm coming through clear. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar and appreciate the opportunity. So tonight I'm going to be speaking about Elinor Ostrom. To her friends, she was known as Lynn. And what I'm going to be doing is going through some slides. Some of these slides might be familiar to a few of you. I've updated and streamlined some of them, but essentially what I'm doing in this this webinar is kind of putting forward a framework for what might be called a left Georgist point of view or political philosophy, and I think you'll probably understand that as I get going through these slides. So the material that I've presented before, I've covered these three concepts, and what I'm doing is using Elinor Ostrom, defining what she did and her accomplishments, but also comparing it to two other concepts. So it's the commons, the uncommons, and the anti-commons. And I think once you understand those three, you'll understand how Ostrom fits within that system. And I find that it's one thing to describe a person and how they think and what their ideas are about, but once you contrast it with others, you get a better appreciation for the subject. So let me go into some of the slides. I always like to quote Lord Macaulay, who said, "Were great pecuniary interests at stake, the acknowledgement of law of gravitation, even now, would be met with opposition." And you'll see a lot of talks about pecuniary interests when you come to talking about the commons and the other factors. So let me kind of put the framework for this larger idea by asking the question, what do Thomas Hobbes, John Stuart Mill, and Henry George have in common? And sure enough, their philosophical outlooks define a triangular space that defines differences among all other political economists. So this is the triangle that I'm using to describe, or first, this philosophical space that's bounded by ideas of the state, Hobbes, and you got John Stuart Mill, the individual, and Henry George, cooperation. Henry George, when he was describing the law of progress, he said that people tend to progress just as they come closer together, and by cooperation with each other, increase the mental power that may be devoted to improvement. But just as conflict is provoked or association develops inequality of condition and power, this tendency to progression is lessened, checked, and finally reversed. So what he says is the remedy is the cooperative delivery of common services and goods paid with the wealth from the capture of economic rent. Today, we look to Scandinavia for examples of what's called Nordic capitalism, where common needs are intentionally met. And I want to leave some of these thoughts with these ideas, that it's all about outcomes. So it's not forms or another alternative such as a free market. It's about respecting natural law, such as historic and culturally responsible resource sharing, and land value as a common pool resource. So this is making the link between Henry George and Elinor Ostrom, is the idea that land value and collecting it is the common pool resource that Elinor described so well. So going from this philosophical space, I go to a political policy space and identify the commons, the uncommons, and the anti-commons. And it might be unusual terminology that I'm presenting, but I'll show you the papers that were written that define these other ideas. I'm certain that commons is familiar with people, but the other two are not. So the response, the policy response to the commons, identify as the common good, and the policy response to the anti-commons, which I'll be getting to, I call gaming the system. And then uncommons, the idea uncommons is the events that don't happen that often, catastrophic events, those kind of things. I call disaster opportunism. And in each of the cases, the common good or the governing the commons is it's a challenge to that outlook. So let's jump right into Elinor Ostrom. She died recently in 2012, having received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, primarily because of her book that was written in 1990. But these papers that I'm going to be talking about tonight, Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin, it was 1968, Tragedy of the Uncommons by Wiener in 2016, and then the Tragedy of the Anti-Commons from Heller, 2013. So these are relatively recent papers, and they're all available online. And if people want to get access to these papers, I recommend they contact Sue or the Council of Georgia's organizations, and I can provide those. So Ostrom's Governing Commons allows us to dismiss the first, which was Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, and I'm going to be getting into that. Correctly frame the second, which was the uncommons, and then challenge with George's ideas the anti-commons. So here's the two links that people can pay attention to. But the title of her book was the subtitle, I guess, The Evolution of Institutions for Collective Action. Probably the most valuable video, and you can see this link here, is shortly before her passing away. She did a marathon little 30-minute talk at the Hayek lecture, memorial lecture, which I thought was kind of an odd thing to do, but she did a very good summary of her thinking and her research that she was doing at the time. So let's get into Garrett Hardin. Tragedy of the Commons. He was a professor of human ecology in Santa Barbara. He warned of the dangers of human population. There's a 1968 book from the article from the Science magazine. I do hear some background talking, so if we can get the mute, I suppose that would work. Now here's the second book, The Uncommons, by Jonathan Wiener, professor at Duke University Law School. He clerked for Stephen Breyer, Supreme Court Justice. says that the uncommon study is a tragedy of neglect, a rare, risky event. So this throwing a monkey wrench into something that might be maybe easy to understand when you're talking about governing the commons, because understanding rare and risky events is kind of problematic, but we'll get into some of those ideas. The subtitle of his book was On the Politics of Apocalypse. A very good video that you might want to watch. He does get into each of the characters that I'm talking about tonight. He talks about Garrett Hardin, talks about Ostrom, talks about Heller. So he's pretty much on the same wavelength as I am. I do go a little bit further than he did in his little talk there. So Michael Heller, he's associated with the anti-commons. He was at the Michigan Law School, got awards. He's currently at Columbia University in real estate law. So the ideas that I'm being presented tonight are not insignificant people. They're very well respected and well positioned. So their ideas are worthy of understanding. He says that in the anti-commons, there's underuse of resources, which he's posing as the opposite of the tragedy of the commons. So let's get into some of these ideas. This is the paper you can get. They're all available. Ostrom specifies common pool, which is the same as Heller's group access, to differentiate a managed commons from one where there are no rules, which is the idea of from neglect, as if no rules. If a government or somebody lets something go to waste, it's as if there aren't any rules. So as an open access, so that's really the key word when we talk about tragedy of the commons. It's really about tragedy of the open access. So you got abandoned factories would be an example of that. And then the best way to see the anti-commons is to see it as the mirror image of the open access commons. And I go into a slide later in the presentation and show that connection. Although erroneous, as I'm explaining it below, there's a resource overuse in the commons. It's the idea that Garrett Hardin had. In the anti-commons, there's underuse. So this is an unfamiliar concept to most people. So let's go into Garrett and what he thought, so we can go through it and dismiss some of the ideas that he had. And this is what I'm calling the response to his tragedy of the commons is the common good, which is Ostrom's approach. So Hardin coined the phrase a tragedy of the commons, saying that ruin is the destruction toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom of the commons brings ruin to all, is his phrase. His solutions were privatizing the commons or state regulation. He had those ideas. He didn't foresee something that Ostrom was talking about, the third way. So in 1991, like a year after after Ostrom's book, he acknowledged that Ostrom was correct about commons management. And he says that he should have called his paper Tragedy of the Unmanaged Commons. And there's a link to that paper there. So he said that the commons, he said commons, but what he meant to say was open access resources. So we're getting now into my research, which I did in Tampa, where I tried to replicate Ostrom's research, what she did in California on groundwater resources. So the research replicated what Ostrom demonstrated to be true, but the analysis of Tampa Bay and Baton Rouge water systems took it further. And there's the links to those documents. There's an evolutionary transition within the 4 property regimes, which I'm going to bring up right now. And there's transition factors involved in each step. So this is my mentor, Daniel W. Bromley, that guided me in this research and introduced me to some fantastic ideas. But he came up with the idea of 4 property regimes called the open access, private state, common pool. He called it common property, but essentially it's the same thing. And so this was a well-known diagram. I think there's some that identify, instead of the common pool quadrant in the upper right, I think it was called club goods. I think common pool is the best position for the example of low exhaustibility and high excludability, which shows the false dichotomy of this private versus state idea. So often you hear in conversations on TV or in conventions or conferences where if the state fails, well, we have to go privatize it because the state's always going to screw up. But if you look at the 4 property regimes, common pool that Ostrom is talking about fits exactly in that. So if you want to note, the page number here is page 48. I could come back and describe those ideas about why common pool would be low on exhaustibility and high on excludability, which is worthy question to be addressed. So these are the 4 property regimes. I'm going to go through each of them because it fits very well in Ostrom's ideas. But these are the transition factors that I discovered in my research, that if you go from an early property regime of open access to private, you always find, when it's talking about water resources, that population increases, water and use increases, impacts to the environment increase. But then when you go to private to state, and also when you go from state to common pool, you find these other 4 transition factors where you have water rights disputes, the understanding of the hydrology is improved, social and political climate favors change. And then the most important factor in this transition is that an individual comes forward and he forces the change. That just because everybody's sitting in a room, nothing's going to happen unless somebody stands up and said, let's go forward. So it's the same thing with state common pool. So when you look at this political policy space where you have commons in the upper portion, you could correctly define Ostrom's 8 design principles of a common pool research and management system as fitting there as compared to the other ideas that I'm going to be getting to in a second. And here's her 8 design principles. And what's important about her design principles is that she looked at examples that differed in centuries, some as going back 800 years when it comes to the Swiss forests, pasture lands that were being managed, and across cultures and geography, that whenever resources were being sustainably used, you always found these 8 design principles. And that's really an example of natural law, well defined. So the first design principle is a clear definition of physical boundaries of the resource pool and membership of the user pool. And then the next principle is appropriation rules. So how are we going to divide up what we all want to manage correctly? And then the idea of collective choice arrangements. So this is a situation where you don't have somebody from the outside, like somebody from Albany or Washington, D.C. saying, this is how you're going to manage a resource. It's people coming together who are impacted and utilize the resource. And then, of course, the rights of appropriators to organize institutions. So if you've got the responsibility to manage something, you've got the right to organize your institutions. And of course, very importantly, monitoring compliance with collective decisions, a range of sanctions to fit the severity of the violation. So you don't necessarily have to ostracize somebody. You can just put your arm around them and tell them, here's the game and how we like to play. And we all are in this for the same reason, to sustain the resource. Low cost conflict resolution mechanisms, very important. And then the last one is sets of rules established within a hierarchy of appropriate institutions for resources within larger resource systems and political jurisdictions. This is also called polycentric governance. This is a term that Lynn Ostrom talks about quite a bit. And what's interesting about this concept is that it plays a role of a group might come together and say they want to manage a resource type sustainably, but they don't quite have it together. So if you have polycentric governance, you might learn from experience of how other institutions operate, and they might change a few things here and there so that the system works together. So it's kind of like iterative process of what works and what doesn't work and how we can tweak this and that. And this is a link to an article about when the principles are ill applied. So there's nothing magic about just writing something down and say we all agree on these 8. You have to apply them well. So these are some of the examples, and for each of these types of systems I got for commons, uncommons, and anti-commons, I show some examples. I might skip a few of them, but the first one I got is a carbon fuel resource rent collected by oil companies recycled to organizations to provide cleaner transit alternatives. This is an idea. I could come back to this idea. We're on slide 64. I did a little calculation suggesting that the fuel that we use in our automobiles and the gasoline, it's worth $300 billion a year that should come back to the users. And I can go through that math if somebody's interested. Going between commons and uncommons, we probably need to spend some money on like a works progress administration for all the poor bridges we have. Earlier, I talked about the Frick Bridge in Pittsburgh, and that was very recent after that happened. And nowadays, you ask people about the Frick Bridge, and it's an old memory, if at all. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, you have an example of 100% affordable housing zoning overlay, which is an excellent way of providing affordable housing, as opposed to tax abatements and other kind of things that happens in New York City. And we got Rick Ryback and his ideas on return and recycle. So we go from open access, could be considered like a Wild West situation, Western states grazing land. So this is federal property, but it's as if it's open access. Also, abandoned inner city might be an example of a open access situation. So here's where we talk about this false dichotomy, where the dominant regime that we're all familiar with is the state. And when the state fails or is captured by private interests, the response is that we turn to stakeholder capitalism, which is essentially going from state to private, where with the global financial crisis, you saw that situation where the banks were bailed out. Then they used the money from that to buy their own stock, which is leading us to the crisis that we're currently in, where the solution should be a common pool approach, which I described what happened in Tampa Bay water and what Henry George talked about, human progress, where the foreclosed homeowners should have been the ones bailed out. So this is an example of get away from the dichotomy between state and private and look at the third alternative, which is a common pool approach. And of course, we've got the historic business cycle, and the question is whether, what are we going to do in the next 4 years, which is, I guess, a hypothetical question. Or so let's go into the conversion, because what I'm trying to do in this presentation is pay honor to Eleanor Ostrom, but I wanted to do the linkage between Ostrom and George, because I'm not sure that everybody has bought into this connection and what I call a left Georgist point of view. So Ostrom talked about common pool resource management system, and Henry George talked about essentially cooperative capitalism. I'm not sure he ever used that word, but I think that fairly captures what he had in mind. Eleanor talked about common pool resource. Henry George talked about land value returned. There's 8 principles for a resource management system. Henry George talked about a logic of natural monopoly. Ostrom talked about a sustainable resource use, and Henry George talked about human progress. Ostrom also talked about this idea of nested systems, systems that serve a greater whole of which they are part, a healthy hierarchy. Markets, commons, households self-organize. There's a need for the state to support all 3. So even though the common pool resource institution exists somewhat autonomously, there is a need for laws in the state to give sanction. Common pool resources are management are regimes for organized dynamic complexity. So this is another term that Ostrom gets into. And unwinding the false dichotomy of private versus state. I thought it's useful to compare what a fish might think about water. You know, the old joke about fish not being aware of his environment and wonders, well, what's water? Because he's immersed in it. But if you think about it, they need water and we need air, water, and land. And I think this is a comparison that we need to keep in mind, because a lot of people will say, yeah, we need air and water. And if I have $1 million, I'll get some land. But in the Henry George School, we think that land is something that is needed by everyone in some fashion. And if we're not owning the land, then we're getting a benefit from the rent that's due people who do have the land. And Ostrom talks about ethical principles, act in the service of human prosperity, respect autonomy in communities, be prudential, and minimize harm. Work with humility by making transparent and the shortcomings of models used, and consider other people. So this is a little break in the presentation. I've covered Ostrom, and part of me wants to say, so maybe I should stop my lecture here, or should we now see how her ideas mesh within a larger context? And I've only gotten halfway past the hour, so let me continue and talk about Jonathan Wiener's uncommons, very important concept. I describe the policy response as disaster opportunism, and on September 11th, 2001, it was a nice sunny day. Uncommons involves a misperception and mismanagement of rare catastrophic events. and risks, and that's what he's talking about. Identification of psychological heuristics and the political forces that underlie neglect of these risks. So he identifies three of these, and I'm going to probably go over those kind of quickly, but he talks about the unavailability heuristic, and then he talks about mass numbing, and then under deterrence. Three important concepts. So let's talk about unavailability heuristic. People's concern is heightened when images are available. Envision and feel importance of an event. Usually they're recent, visible, and worrisome. Regulation is crisis driven. And you think about the outcome of 2001, we had the Patriot Act, which overcomes opposition because of the importance of it. We have to do something. The public is more concerned about unusual, dramatic risks, and they're less about familiar routines. Experts aren't like that, and we'll show in some of the diagrams here. There's more concern about accidents with airplanes than automobiles. There's an assumption that public favors more regulation of uncommon events. So here's his diagram for unavailability heuristic, where he's showing that there's less concern about familiar risks and that have high frequency, and the usual but available risks that are low frequency, same kind of concern. And this is the Frick Bridge that collapsed in early 2022. Ultra low frequency risk to picture, not the case that the public favors more regulation. It's related to this availability heuristic. Rare events are not recent, visible, or experienced. They lead to complacency, neglect. Human extinction, climate change, and failed infrastructure are some examples of this complacency. And then you can see the finishing of his diagram on the lower left, where extreme risks are just not available because you haven't experienced them, so they're not available to your mind. And we talk about the Frick Bridge, the Grenfell Tower disaster in London. I put in there the Citizen United example, where people were convinced that corporations are people and money is speech. So those two ideas that didn't come to mind until of that. You got the 9/11 attacks. Unusual but available risk. Dying in a plane crash, you can kind of appreciate that. Dying from anthrax. But dying in a car crash, those are familiar risks. So you are, even though the frequency are high and the airplane risks are low, you put them on the same type of concern. And those are the ideas. And Wiener talks about two features of your brain that are working in this kind of situation, where the amygdala, which is the fear and instant choice, or the flee or flight, is working. And then you have the prefrontal cortex, which you envision hypothetical future scenarios, and you can analyze choice. So when you have time, you can do that. So the former process is faster, generating fear before the latter has a chance to kick in. In politics, you find neglect of the short-term costs, leaving long-term benefits hanging. So we're always doing that amygdala. Uncommons, so now we switch to the second concept, which is mass numbing, and it might be familiar to some people. Uncommons or risks usually have large magnitude of impact. People are willing to pay more to save a few people, but less for many, which might be kind of curious to most people. And we can return to that. This is slide 121, but that's what he found in his research. This explains the neglect of genocide and other mass casualties, including environmental disasters. And it's showing that information can be overwhelming. that we have limited capacity to worry, and it leads to the messes that we see around. And an example that's close to my heart, I was in New Orleans during Katrina. In terms of mass numbing, a 10-term congressman from Baton Rouge said about public housing residents, which were primarily poor African Americans, that we finally cleaned up public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did, with the idea that the Katrina was a natural disaster, but it wasn't. It was an engineering professional analysis that it was the levees improperly designed and installed. No public housing structure suffered water damage, yet they're all torn down because that was the agenda. And with the mass numbing going on, they had their way. So this is the diagram for mass numbing. You can see the spike early in the graph here on the lower left, going high concern, then dropping off. We see shootings almost every day nowadays. When I made this diagram, it was Columbine shooting in 1999, high concern, a relatively few people killed. And then by 2013, there's 94 school shootings every year, and that might be spiking up. But the idea is that it's kind of a ho-hum kind of thing in the large measure. It's terrible when they happen, but you can hardly think of a time when there weren't shootings going on. And then you had the George Floyd riots, mass numbing, you had displacement, you had another factor in this mass numbing idea is a supra-linear catastrophe premium, where you have few people involved, but there's a high concern, another aspect of this mass numbing. Expanding NATO to Russia's doorstep, which is the number of lives involved in the concern. Dying of AIDS, it was something that was very much of a concern in the 80s, but you have this plateau with a diminishing marginal concern. And then the third of this uncommon idea is this under deterrence, where the legal mechanism may have weak or no deterrent effects. The disasters might be too big to handle. So why would you buy insurance if the company is not going to be around to cover the risks? You have there may be no defendants to sue. Public institutions offer ex post disaster relief and bailout, but there's a moral hazard to underinvesting in ex ante protective measure. So the challenge for smart management of the uncommons is priority setting. Go outside of an ongoing crisis, the public and experts can weigh options with their prefrontal cortex unhindered by the amygdala running amok. And you can raise revenue wisely. You can follow this ASTM standard that I'm very familiar with. Talk about the Frick Bridge. So here are some of the examples of the political policy space when we talk about the uncommons, and we talk about the WPA again for fixing those bridges. We had a very notable success in the ozone depleting chemical regulations, banning the chlorofluorocarbons. There are some extreme measures for anthrax, and then the loss of liberty with the Patriot Act, all related to the uncommons. Defunding the police was an example. Single issue charities is an example of pulling at the heartstrings to, as an example of uncommons. Standing up to cancer, give money to charities. And then the positioning of the idea of urban gentrification in this three-cornered space, I thought pretty close to the center, which we can discuss if people are interested. In the disaster in Johnstown, in the 1880s, I think. There was an example of a volunteer group springing up, and it was head up by the people that caused a disaster. So you should always be conscious of who's offering volunteer help. They might be the people that caused it. So now we're going to go to the third, and we'll be wrapping up the talk. Talk about the political policy space of the anti-commons, and the gaming the system is the example. The best way to see this is to see the mirror image of the open access commons. Although erroneous, as I explained above, there's resource overuse in the commons. In the anti-commons, there's underuse. This idea is unfamiliar to a lot of people. Yeah, Heller says that when privatizing the commons goes too far, you get fragmentation of rights to a resource, thus underuse, because nobody can agree on what the use should be. Each can block the other. So the solution is to have a monopoly to reduce the individual rights. You have a jumping for joy monopoly guy when it comes to the anti-commons. And this is the interesting, I call it an elegant but misleading display of the commons, anti-commons continuum, where he has open access on the left and full exclusion on the right, a diagram of the going from common pool to anti-commons. This is the zone of cooperative and market-based solutions. But if you think about the diagram that I created, this is but one edge of the political policy space, where you have that continuum between the commons and anti-commons. And this is the diagram once again. Heller's example was that there's too many toll takers on the Rhine River under the Holy Roman Empire. Trade was protected. Then in the 13th century, the German barons began collecting tolls. You had up to like 200 of them. Trade ceased, everybody loses, even the barons. So bringing the concept to today, there's too many owners that paralyze markets. Well-functioning private property is a fragile balance between extremes of underuse and overuse. Interesting that the word overuse was coined in the 1600s, but the underuse is a relatively new word, first used in 1960. And you could use the word optimal, but we can also talk about sustainable use. We're talking about regulation of risk. Interesting that New York City's Central Park is an example of the anti-commons, where people couldn't agree on what to do with the center space in Manhattan. So rather than developing, you had a lot of multiple vetoes. I think most notable is the case of pharmaceuticals, where you had an Alzheimer's drug that never came to market because there's too many people holding different patents, and they all holding out for a high price. And this is what's called the patent anti-commons, which may be a creation of how the patent system works, but still. In art and music, you have many owners of bits of culture. In telecommunication, conflict over the electromagnetic spectrum. Real estate, you have the difficulty of assembling multiple owners together. And in the oil and gas industry, you have another conflict of how to manage the resource. So even though the gains in cooperation are in the billions, corporations battle for these minute gains. So there are solutions to overuse and underuse. You can, the state may assert ownership, have tradable quotas, or as Daniel Bromley suggests, is that you measure what you caught at the dock and have that be the basis for sustainability. We got underuse of land, and I've got this example from the Occupy Wall Street with the 1% and the 99%, and rather than go through each of these examples, what I'm laying out here is that the unearned wealth from monopoly, you see unearned income from land and resource rent, earned income, tax abatements, offshore profits, all these nice things that make the 1% so wealthy. Then you got people like the most of us where we have wage income, but we got a lot of money coming out of our pockets in taxes and rents and income taxes. And the equitable taxes would be to collect the resource rent and the land rent, and don't offer tax abatements. And then by doing that, you get the money coming back to people such as ourselves. And this is what's called land value return and recycle. We do have anti-monopoly laws. The problem is that many lawmakers are in the pocket of monopolists, which makes it important that fair elections are held. Like I did with the other types of commons, uncommons, any-commons, a market-based response, and not where the nature is not at risk, it could probably fall between the commons and any-commons, that there is a place for market-based solutions as there are for government. Stakeholder capitalism, I would put it between the commons and any commons. The 421A tax abatement, which recently expired, is more toward the any commons. The beneficiary of the Citizens United. Let me look at my my clock here. I got 7:47. If I could, let me just run through these, because this is a very interesting history going back to the enclosures. There's plenty of common land existed. And, you know, we learn in school about the Magna Carta, but we don't learn about the Forest Charter. And I think if we did, we might have a little bit more affinity to Ostrom's ideas about governing the commons, because there was 1215, where you had an unpopular king trying to assuage the rebel barons. They pinned this thing by the archbishop, and there's 63 clauses. Importantly, the royalty had no universal divine right, so that was the importance of the Magna Carta. You had a council of 25 barons, but neither the king nor the barons or even the Pope, Innocent III, really thought much about the Magna Carta. So they redrafted the Magna Carta. John's son penned the Forest Charter at the same time for common people. There are some interesting phrases in the redrafting where they had maintenance of nature and agricultural land with land revenues. They had women's rights to land. And then people outside the forest need not appear before the royal justices. And interesting that the Forest Charter, the first of 16 clauses, protected common forest pasture for those accustomed to it. And they talk about every man to collect wood in the forest as he wishes. Every man may make a mill, fish pond, ditch, cultivate land, as long as there's no injury to any neighbor. So Henry VII, he began the enclosures, and essentially that's when agriculture developed. The common rights over land were abolished with the fencing in. Breeding of animals took off. Wool was usually the animal. And through this process, England dominated the woolen industry through a mercantilist empire. So while the enclosures meant that some lost, others did not. And you had a growing population, so this was a way of feeding that population. So somebody that's more to our understanding, King George III, the guy that we beat in the revolution, he had the enclosure movement kind of gained pace under him, where he had the General Enclosure Act of 1801, something that he could do now that the United States was a independent country. So the nouveau rich farmers, they could enclose their land without prior parliamentary act. This hit the poor hard, especially landless peasants that had common land for pasture. They need seek work. They went to the towns where it was industrializing. So many historians believe that these were the prerequisite for the Industrial Revolution. So my last two slides, and we can get to the Q&A, where the common people failed to institutionalize. And I think this is the message from the last set of slides about the enclosures and the experience in England, is that it's up to the common people to institutionalize their commons. It's not enough to say we need to reclaim the commons, because there's got to be an act by an individual. And we need to organize these institutions by Ostrom's 8 design principles. So they didn't back in the England time. So it was privatized. There wasn't a big enough force to institutionalize the commons. And I compare this to just as when Georges failed to capture society's land rent for social purposes, when you don't do it, something's going to happen. So I suggest that we don't romanticize this failure to act, kind of like the raccoon that failed to cross the road. So that was my slides. Pay attention to the way that you can get a hold of me. The best way is to look at my phone there, 504-453-2898. You can text me. I'm on LinkedIn. I have Twitter and my email with the Gmail. So Nick, I'm ready for Q&A or some chat. Let me take this back to where I think somebody might have a question. Okay, well, I'm ready for Q&A.
Got a question for you, Marty. This is Sue.
Sure.
The question being, you talk about the commons, but how do we reclaim that without getting, somebody all of a sudden decides that you have a pool, seeing the word common pool, and they decide they want to use it. But now we have the problem of insurance, because if somebody that is not a member of our family decides to use our swimming pool and something happens to them, it's our insurance that goes up,
Yeah.
not, and we have to pay damages to the person who trespassed on our property. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so interesting. That's a very relevant and timely case. So I think it's all in the setting up of the common pool institution. So I would say that the arrangement was half-baked that you described, that it was not fully thought through. If you had a swimming pool and you owned it and you wanted to have other people participate, somehow you would have to describe that using this pool, we're going to have an institution for common usage. So the fact that you own it, you might want to sell shares of that swimming pool to the people who are going to use it. And by that kind of arrangement, you might form a agreement that here's the rules that we're going to abide by. And you, the original owner, is not going to be sued for whatever happens at those people. So what you describe is not an ideal situation for a common pool arrangement. It's a very serious and well thought through process. I'm not sure something that
what I'm talking about is a private swimming pool on quote
Yeah.
private property where there is
Yeah.
a deed,
Yeah.
and somebody trespasses,
Yeah.
not somebody
Yeah.
but
Well,
they want to go swimming. They can't get into the local pool because it is the fire department has said only so many people can get in, and yet they hurt themselves, just
Yeah.
like,
So
so,
you talking about the situation where you call up 911 and nobody responds?
yeah, well, that, or the fact that I will tell you, as a kid, we came home, we had an above ground pool, and kids I knew from grade school were in our swimming pool.
Yeah, well,
They were not invited.
yeah, well,
They had no
this is not
privileges of being there.
this is not an example where a common pool arrangement is in existence. It's something that you have to be in tune with or agree to it. That's just common lawlessness.
But that's what some people would think. Okay, so how do we differentiate between private property and the commons? And
Okay. Well, let me describe what happened in Tampa. It was thought that common pool arrangements are only applicable of maybe 10, 20, 30, 50 people who are sharing something like 20 trees in a forest or something like that. Or maybe a groundwater well or something. But in Tampa, you have over 2 million people sharing the water from 3 different counties. It's a very conservative part of Florida. So they're not prone to socialist type solutions, but they found that when they got away from everybody owning their own little well to sharing it, they didn't have to worry about it anymore. And actually they saved money because of the arrangement. They interlinked their groundwater wells. They captured the Hillsborough River more efficiently. They even built a desalination system so that there would never be a shortage of water. And, you know, they got pretty good rates on their water. So this was, and I tracked all the design principles of Eleanor Ostrom, and they met all of them. And it just happened that the guy who set up that arrangement was very well familiar with Ostrom's work. So he designed the laws and the regulations and the agreements in that fashion. So that's how you do it. There's nothing magical about common pool arrangements, but they have to be well thought out. And there's a reason why there's 8 of them.
Yeah. Ed Dotson has his hand up.
Sure.
Let's see if I can unmute Ed. There we go.
Are you able to hear me?
Yep, we're
Yeah.
able to hear you.
Marty, where in the scheme of systemic structures here would the Mondragon cooperative network in Spain fall?
I'm not familiar with the system in Spain. Is this a irrigation system?
No. This is a network of cooperative enterprises that operate in a for-profit basis, but which are owned by members, and they include social welfare services as well as public goods. This was started, I think, around the 1920s by a Catholic order in that part of Spain, and it is expanded and is a very significant economic player in that part of Spain.
I can guess that they own the land, that they're not renting it from anybody.
I don't know for sure, but I would assume that they certainly would own a good deal of the land on which they operate, although they could certainly be leasing land. The cooperative network could be leasing land from private entities or from the public sector.
Yeah, so that would be a key factor there. So I guess the answer to that is that you haven't heard any comparisons made that is following Ostrom's 8 principles. So that would suggest that maybe somebody hasn't studied that, or maybe there's a an alternate way of doing things that works close and maybe as well as a common pool approach. But it would be, it's something I'm going to look into and follow up and see how well they're doing that, because that might be, I don't know if I want to call it a one-off of common pool arrangement, but it might be equally valid as a way of optimizing resource use and health effects and other infrastructure types.
I put it to you mainly because initially when you said that what you're discussing is a left approach, and the economist Richard Wolff, who describes himself as a Marxist, but is a very strong proponent of cooperative enterprise, talks about cooperative enterprises and industrial democracy as a key to what he would call a modern approach to socialist structure.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic there. And I'm teaching this class on Wednesdays, just to let everybody know, teaching Brian Hodgkinson's book on the model of a new economy. And he does a very good job of differentiating between a Marxist approach and his approach, which is Georgist. And it has a lot to do with land tenure and the idea of credit, that there's, the entrepreneur is not the evil one, but what is evil is a lack of a credit to those people who could pull off something like a cooperative venture. They're excluded from getting loans from bank because they don't have assets, or nobody knows who they are. But in a more of a Georgia system, they would be able to get higher wages, for example, and maybe they could save up, maybe they could form some kind of a reputation or ability to get that bank credit. And then the land tenure is to have the land value taxation system. So that's what he pulls out to show that the Marxist solution is not the ideal way, even though Brian Hodgkinson is definitely talking about a cooperative way of running society. Does that address your question?
I think it's a long discussion, a lot more than we can talk about in a minute or two.
Yeah, it's good that you brought it up, because I think we need those examples that, like what I'm saying, the false dichotomy between state and private solutions. We need to go way beyond recognizing that and looking at alternate structures. I think Ostrom has a good framework for capturing common pool, and that's why I identify land value as a common pool resource. Because I think if we treat that, let's say, rather than water in Tampa, we look at Manhattan or the whole city of New York, and it's the land value that we are all sharing. And we wouldn't be so quick to give a tax break to a luxury condo developer that's selling these units to overseas billionaires and oligarchs who don't pay a tax. I mean, it's totally insane. So we're not treating land value as our common pool. And I think if we put our Eleanor Ostrom hat on and look at it, land value a different way, we'd be outraged to what we're putting up with.
Well, what we do is find ways to mitigate the operation of land markets as they exist. I mean, that's what I did for 20 years at Fannie Mae. Try to find a way to outsmart the market or subsidize the market and provide decent, affordable housing to people. But it's a very costly endeavor.
Yeah. Well, I think I think a lot of people owe a debt of gratitude to you and your persistence to try to make that happen. Well, appreciate the question, Ed. You always pose some very well thought out and good case studies. Well, we got time for a few more. We got a lot of people on the call. I'd like to welcome anybody that came in through the LinkedIn invite that I sent out. Sue, you see anything in the chat or?
Yeah, I do. I see. Hold on. I have somebody else who's raised their hand. Hang on here. So one person who would raise. Hold on here. Where is it? Looking down. Not going far enough. Hold on. Maybe it's one of us. No. Hold on. Let me find it. I can't find. Dan, do you see who it is?
Nope.
I don't see it. Let's see. Hold on. Somebody's got their hand raised. And can't find. It's not showing up on. Wait, hold it. It's that again. It's that again.
It is me again?
Yes.
It said still.
I didn't mean to. I mean,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
always can dominate a conversation if you let me.
Yeah. We'll just keep on going until somebody raises their hand.
Yeah.
So you got another question, Ed?
Well, I mean, I'm just listening to you with these, sort of competing theories of how human beings interact, and what the best way to get people to interact cooperatively is.
Yeah.
And certainly you and I would agree that Henry George's insights were specifically valuable in that case.
Yeah.
So it's always a question of what institutional structures will lead to the highest level of cooperative behavior. And I just returned from a trip to Germany, visited Berlin, Dresden, and Munich. And many things about Germany were interesting, but what was most interesting to me is the extent to which the Germans have rebuilt their entire country, and specifically with the fall of the Berlin Wall, rebuilt East Berlin and East Germany. The social commitment to rebuilding those cities, rebuilding the country, was really impressive. And I came home thinking, we can't even rebuild some of the devastated parts of our cities that have suffered deindustrialization and aging. I mean, that to me is a subject worth studying. What have the Germans been able to do with a smaller GDP, welcoming in post-World War II, welcoming immigrants as part of their social redesign. And yet here we are in the United States with the most massive GDP in the world. And we have cities that are still looking like they were bombed out, like Dresden was in the 1940s.
Yeah. Well, I think it's clear there's something within the German culture that would lend themselves to that type of approach. I think we all are aware of the immigration into the United States in the 1800s, where a lot of Germans came to Wisconsin, Minnesota, and it's no surprise that La Follette and other early progressives came from that German tradition. So I think that's the answer to the question about why Germany can do it, is that they've got an attitude and have an approach to life. I'm not sure about the wisdom of getting rid of their nuclear plants and being beholden to Russia on gas, and now they're building coal plants. But I guess there's always opportunities to learn.
But it sounds like an area of research that fits what you've been working on.
Well, I was really amazed of the difficulty of what I'm talking about and the common pool approach when you talk about the Wiener example of the uncommons, is that there's how the human mind works and dealing with disaster and uncommon events, where you could even knowingly create diversions so that you can get somebody's mind off something and then pull your fast one. It's just the way that the human mind works. After 9/11, it was so easy to pass the Patriot Act and all those loss of liberties that we still haven't regained. So it makes it even more important to be conscious of what we have, what we could lose. How do we recognize something that's a little bit off that we need to pay a little bit more attention to? They talk about, if you see something, say something. Well, maybe there's something to that, because as far as I know, the world is not like a big clock that's wound up every couple centuries, that there's actually individual actors that can play a big role. Just, you just look at Henry George. He wrote the book, got popular, and then all of a sudden there's a mayor's race. And if he had handled that notoriety as well as he could have, things might have been different. But it took a personality to intervene and make things real. And that's the challenge, is to keep that kind of motivation and insight going. Well, it looks like we're entertaining the people who are still on the call. Why don't we, Dan, did you want to say anything about the Bill Gates and the clean and green in Pennsylvania?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say that they've given special tax exemptions to people holding land in its environmentally pristine condition. And so Bill Gates bought up 6,000 acres of land in Armstrong County well over a decade ago. And the other residents of that county had to get a tax increase to cover the revenue shortfall. And
they're probably not doing anything different than Bill Gates is.
Well, no, the ordinary people who live there and have houses there and stuff are paying more taxes because he's paying less.
Yeah.
And those clean and green exemptions are to me, they're the modern version of the enclosure acts, where the nobles said, we have to enclose this land to prevent overhunting of game. And when America wanted to limit the hunting of game, they rejected that approach, and they issued licenses with limits. You can capture 6 fish and no more, or you can capture, the limit on deer is like 1 deer a year, because there's so many people who want to go deer hunting. So, the American approach was, well, if we're going to have a limit, it's going to be the same limit for everybody, rather than excluding a bunch of people from access to benefit the nobility who have that exclusive access.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, I think in the case of the forests, I think there's a desire for companies to invest in a ESG fund, where Gates might say, I'm selling the sequestration potential of my forest and it's going for so many dollars per acre. So then those companies can go back to their shareholder and say, look what good work I'm doing. And all they're doing is tacking on to Bill Gates's tax abatement.
Anyhow, if there's no more questions, maybe we should just wrap up and Sue can tell us what's the next.
Sounds
Next
good.
one, yeah, next, on Saturday, we have, the Commons and the Critique of Capitalism. Did Karl Marx understand the land question with Dave Wetzel, moderated by Mark Sullivan. It starts at 2:00 on Saturday, the 25th, that's Eastern time. Next Tuesday, we're gonna have Recovering the Commons from Rising Property, from property prices. How will a land value tax system lower the cost of housing and make life affordable? This will be, Floyd Merceau is going to be the leader of this discussion, and the moderator will be Travis Adams. So do stay tuned. We will be eventually getting these videos up on our YouTube channel. It's just that Dan and I are doing 2 of these a week, so it is intensive to do it. So we thank you for your patience, and if anybody's we're gonna make everybody a panelist. So if you want to hang out and talk a little bit, even if it's the weather, you can talk about the weather. Sound good?
Sounds
Sounds
good.
good.
Appreciate your work. Thanks, Sue.
All right, sure.
Thanks, Dan.